make a case for indictment or a case against indictment. He simply flooded the jury with all possible information about the case so they couldn't make a decision of any type. And I think those types of, that's what we're facing in a way. It's not a simple kind of, they oppose African American rights or they're in favor of police brutality, but they can actually do things to flood the senses, flood the conversation so that there's no way to even articulate a response. And I remember that sense of frustration at the time and recall it again this evening. So I want us to, I think both about what we can do in a kind of obvious way, but also how can we push back against these strategies that are really meant to divert us and to frustrate our emotions.
So I'm gonna stand up because I'm hoping that my comments can be a jumping off point also to start the conversation. And I want to talk very specifically about something that you talked about, which is the trauma of being an organizer and the psychological toll it takes to be an organizer. I've been one of the organizers around the Ink Coffee protest around the gentrification. I think a lot of you have heard about. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But I started my activism at the age of 5 years old. My mother, it might have been even earlier than that, maybe 4. And she was with the Chicano student movement. And so we were out there on the front lines, fighting for immigrant rights, boycotting grapes, boycotting lettuce, working in unity with the Mexican-American farm workers. And so my mother would have her 2 little daughters out there with a sign in front of Safeway, boycotting grapes. And so I would be out there with my little 5-year-old voice, boycott grapes. Not understanding fully why I was out there. And so I'd ask my mother, you know, on one of those hot days, like, why are we boycotting grapes? Like, I like grapes. And because we were poor and we were on food stamps and we lived in the projects, grapes were actually a delicacy, right? So we couldn't afford them all the time. And so when I asked my mom this question, why couldn't we eat the grapes? She said, because there's blood on them. And in my little kid mind, I couldn't quite reconcile. So every time I'd go into Safeway, I'd look for the blood speckles on the grapes. But I came to understand, as I grew older, what she meant. And that is, we cannot benefit off of the backs of others who are suffering. And we have a responsibility to fight. Now that may sound simple, it may sound easy. How many of you have ever organized an action? Okay, so a good number of you. That's great. So you know how hard it is, right? You know how hard it is to organize, to get people to turn out, to be disciplined, to have a message. But what I want to particularly emphasize is being a target. Because that also goes along with the spectacle that is created. It goes along with the wins that you might have. But you better be damn ready to become a target. And there's nothing glamorous or nice about being a target. Because the purpose of targeting you is to shut you down. Shut down your voice, shut down your message, shut down your movement. When I was the Black Student Alliance president at Metro State, my undergrad years, I remember walking through the halls one day because we have led a successful action, but then life happens, So I was walking down the hall, and so one of my mentors saw me, and he's like, Lisa, why are you looking so down? And I was like, you know, I'm getting all of these criticisms. I'm getting it from media, I'm getting it from white students who don't believe in students of color having equitable access. I'm getting it from our own people. I'm getting it from the males in our group who don't believe a woman should be out front leading the movement. And so he stops and he looks at me and he says, Lisa, if you are not a target, you are not doing your job. Because part of the belief is that when you do something right, people will like you. They will want to be with you. And the reality is that happens too, but there's also a lot of people who, you know, if we're people of color and we're going at it, can be our own internalized trauma and oppression playing off and triggering each other. It can be the powers that be. So just a couple of quick examples before I turn it over for the conversation. 2 recent examples. So I am the executive director of the Community Reentry Project. And this is an initiative that was fought for by the people who resisted jail expansion. I was one of the founders of that 10 years ago. I've been the executive director for the past 8 years. So we created and grew this movement, and so we in the jails, but we're not just providers. We fight for the rights of incarcerated people. And guess what? The system doesn't like that. So what do they decide to do, even though we've had to fight for our funding every single year, which the system doesn't have to do? Right? You can be terrible and still get funded and not have to justify it. In fact, my good friend Christy Donner says with the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, you know, the criminal justice system is one of those bureaucracies where it can do worse and still get more money. And so that's what we were up against. And because the mayor of Denver didn't like my political speech criticizing him, the city's policies, he decided recently to defund our program. So all of those folks that we had been working with, fighting for the past 10 years, so that can feel like a real defeat. And it is. But when you understand the cycles of being targeted and rebuilding, this is part of a cycle. And so what we can do is we can either stop and give up and feel defeated, or we can continue to fight, which is what we're doing. And then just a second quick example is this gentrification resistance. And we're made up of a coalition of a lot of organizers who have been, you know, basically resisting in different spheres, so whether it be for housing equity, anti-poverty, the anti-urban camping ban movement, all of those. So we're bringing all of the, we're at a place of convergence. And so some of us were saying in our organizing meeting, this cannot just be about a sign. The sign is symbolic for how Black and brown communities are being pushed out and displaced, and how our voices are not being heard, and how it's being done under the regime of people who look like us. So we have to be really, really careful when we just go to a black-white paradigm, because we're obviously forgetting all of the other cultural nuances in between. But we also have to recognize that just because they look like us and, you know, sound like us doesn't mean that they're going to be for us. And so how are you going to resist that when your oppressor looks like yourself? Thanks.
I want to applaud that.
So first, I would like to open up to the other panelists if you have any, not rebuttals, I was going to say rebuttals. Any responses to Lisa, what Lisa had to say, anything you want to follow up on, and then we'll open it up to.
I think definitely with the idea that the oppressor looks like you, it's very important, especially on this campus.
Sure.
Because, okay, sorry. I will speak louder. I've never been asked to do that before. But when we're looking at people, especially those who I think oppose being uppity, and if you don't know what that means, it's like trying to fight the system, trying to be the person who's always upset, always looking for something more, like you're trying to break out of this mold. When we look at some of the activism we've done on this campus, specifically last year with our die-ins, we had people come up to some of our members who were laying down and say, nah, they're just trying to get on the news. Nah, they're gonna get shot. Nah, like, they're just not about anything. And these were black people saying this to us. I didn't have any white people come up and question what I was doing. I had a couple of weird looks, but the people who really it hurts to hear aren't for you are the ones who look like you. And even within communities, within families, I think it's really powerful to understand not everyone was for desegregating, and not everyone was for school integration, black people included. And so I think the most powerful thing to realize is the oppressor within yourself, and to look in the mirror and say, how am I keeping myself down today, and what am I buying into that's not for me, that's actively against myself, and will ultimately bring me down. So I think that's really important to know.
Okay. Questions, comments?
How do you generally approach people who maybe, everything else being equal, would like to fight against the system, but they benefit so much from it that they get afraid of people who fight against the system, and they start to automatically, subconsciously demonize them, even if they're not trying to pick a fight, just because they feel insecure.
Can you be a little more specific?
I wish I could, but I'm not smart enough to.
No, I don't think that's true.
Yes, so I'm having a little trouble, like, what, so are you...
So I think a lot of people see, people who aren't in those type of communities, like Ferguson, they look at the police and they look at, like, their police department, and they think, well, because they live in, like, 90% white communities, and they're like, well, this police department has been helping me, and they think about their personal situation, and they have a hard time extrapolating out to these other communities, and they have a hard time realizing it's a bigger picture. And even though I've been living okay, it's what my situation has been as a part of it. And it's understandable that they don't want to give up something that's good in their life. But at the same time, if they don't, maybe they don't have to give it up. They just have to acknowledge that some of the things I used to think were good were actually covering up some horrible things. Like, how do you approach that?
Okay, I think that there's maybe two schools of thought about how to expand the constituency of a movement. One might be to do what you're describing, right? To try to find a way of transforming folks who are not on board, and convincing them that the moral thing to do, or the righteous thing to do, would be to support movement for change. Or one can devote energy towards creating sort of mutual support and affinity amongst folks who are already on one side. And I think that that's probably a healthier expenditure of energy. For one thing, it's going to be more positive affect in general, right? If they already agree with you. And that's what we saw in the film, right? People who already loved each other simply saying so again, right? Because there's no reason why you shouldn't, one can't be filled up on those things. And the struggle drains one's sense of self-love and self-worth, as Lisa mentioned, right? So we need each other, and those who already agree with each other, to kind of work together in that sense. I think that there's an overemphasis on how to convert the agnostics, instead of how to keep the kind of flock healthy and self-supportive. And so I would encourage you to put your energy towards people who are already on your side as much first, You know, the movements that made change in this country and others didn't necessarily convince anyone to change their mind, but they did create such a large block of support that could not be ignored, right, by the major institutions, be it the state or be it capital, right? So I would strongly encourage you to not bang your head against the wall and to find the more the softer edged folks and hug on them.
Is violence ever justified in our movement?
Which movement?
Struggle.
Any movement?
Yeah, what we're trying to accomplish.
What is violence?
Thank you.
Like what the woman said in the film. What is violence? Do you mean violence against bodies or violence against property? So I might be a little extra because for me, when someone is violently opposing your existence, I'm not saying that you should strike them as well. But when someone is after you, when someone is attacking you, when there's like this means to say, oh, we'll be peaceful. I think people bring up the idea of Gandhi a lot, and I find that very problematic. What you had in the situation of the non-violence of India was like a brown elephant versus a white mouse. What you have in America is the white elephant and the brown mouse. If the elephant chooses to sit down, it will kill the mouse. And that's what we're seeing with the oppression in these communities. It shouldn't be a violent uprising. It should be an educated one. But in cases, I don't want to say that I condone violence in its totality, but what is violence and what is being done? Like, I feel like in some cases it can be justified.
This actually came up in our conversation around gentrification, and so when we were, so Inc. coffee had been defaced. And so the media wanted to make a big deal and wanted some of the activists to denounce that action, right? Because it was defacing and destructive, whatever. And so my position is, so one, I have worked with victims of violence, and I work with people in jails who have committed violence. So for me, that's not actually the question. I want everybody to respect the humanity of everyone. And so when I'm an activist on the front lines around police accountability, and we have activists who are calling law enforcement officers pigs, even if they are engaging in abusive conduct, my position is I'm not down with that. Because language can also be violent. Because what we're trying to get to is to recognize the humanity of everyone, and if I am therefore being inhumane to someone else, that is not the model that I want to see. So of course it's in the absence of self-defense, absence of, you know it's coming, so it's kind of like a preemptive. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the question of what is violence and the psychological violence. So when we were being kind of goaded into condemning the graffiti, and so for those of you who don't know, someone sprayed white coffee, right, on the Inc. Building. And so, what I said to that was, I don't support, and we don't support the defacing of property. That said, what is defacement? Because when you rename our communities, Slow High, Highlands, Low High, Rhino, that's also violence to us. That's defacing our cultural communities. So those don't get labeled as defacing or violent acts, even though there's a psychological violence that's happening that says, you do not belong here and we are taking from you without your consent. And that is a colonialist construct which is inherently violent.
And it's, what's Cheyenne Arapaho residence hall being referred to as? Shy Hope. So it's the same, yeah.
I have
Problems.
That's fine.
What's that?
No.
Okay, I saw some other hands.
It's just kind of adding on to that. I've heard that violence kind of sometimes brings the attention of the media, because without violence, usually they're like, oh, it's peaceful, and media doesn't approach it, doesn't talk about it and stuff like that. And in Ferguson, most of the media was in the violence, and because of the violence, I was able to hear on Twitter or other social media about what was actually going on. So it's just a question of wondering if violence could be helpful or not helpful. I understand your point, but I kind of the media situation stuff.
So I appreciate the question, and which is violence helpful or not helpful? And again, I think that's not the question to ask. I think it's the reframing. In what context is this violence happening? So as Dr. Martin Luther King said, and I'll paraphrasing, but riots are the voice of the voiceless, basically the unheard. And so, because he too was being kind of goaded to condemn the violence. So let's put it into context. Let's understand why people may be resorting to that, because it's often a reaction to something.
I just wanted to add on to that. Because one of the things that's interesting about the Michael Brown case and all the cases that I think have sparked our political imagination is that they begin with violence, right? So if there would be no story on CNN if someone hadn't been killed. There wouldn't be a story on CNN about municipal fines and debt collection, because that doesn't catch headlines. So I think that to add on to Lisa, we have to be critical about the notion of what violence is. And we also have to recognize that the ability to determine whether an act is violent or not is about power, right? So the state can say that Darren Wilson's acts were self-defense and therefore not violent, and they can describe Brittany's behavior as not only violent, but a kind of tribal chanty violence. And that's the power of the state to determine what is violent and what isn't. And so part of what I think our movements have to do is engage that very question, right, of who can decide what counts as violence. And if we find that there's only some people whose injuries count and some people who can say what violence is and what isn't, then that actually might be the point of the movement in the first place. So we can't be afraid of it, I think, because it's part of why we're all here. So.
Yeah.
So the North Denver newspaper a couple years ago put out a report after analyzing Center for Disease Control data and showed that Denver had the second most lethal law enforcement agency in the country. And part of that, I think, was that also we hadn't indicted a police officer for a killing in Denver for about 23, 24 years at that time. So I'm wondering if folks have hope with the new, and I'm looking to you, Lisa Calderon, about whether you have some hope with the new district attorney in Denver, and whether you've had any engagement with that office since she's taken that position and was elected.
So first, let me just give the context for which I engage in police accountability. It actually really took off when my son, when he was 15 years old and we moved into the Cole neighborhood, which is just outside of Five Points, downtown Denver, was walking home from high school. I'd just gotten off the bus, was crossing over to the next bus stop, but because his bus stop was wrapped in police tape, he walked under it. There was nobody around until he saw these two police officers jump out of the car and grab him and basically roughed him up in an alley. And he's 15 years old. And he's telling them what I've always trained him to do, is that I want to talk to my mother. And they made fun of him and said, "Oh, you want your mommy." Now, a young black male child, in my view, as his mother, an act of violence happened to him that day. And the fact that the police department didn't care, despite witnesses who said, "We saw this happen," dismissed the complaint, what it did is it sent me on a rampage to change that department. And so we organized collectively. So that was, gosh, about 12 years ago. And as a result of that, what's important to me is that we also just don't protest, right? Protest is kind of like that visual of resistance, but if you want to, and I have a law degree and I taught criminal justice, if you want to impact the masses of people, you do it through public policy. And that is much less glamorous, it's tedious, you're sitting across the table from people who you probably don't like, but you go through the process, and that takes discipline. And so going to this new DA, I mean, I think that she is much more open, Beth McCann, than our previous DA, where it was a closed question, really, of prosecuting any law enforcement. So she's already started to do that. But I also want to put it in the context of policy. If we have policies that excuse this type of behavior, and we have laws that excuse this type of behavior, because quite frankly, today all an officer has to say is, "I feared for my life." That's it. And I have organized with mothers whose children have been killed by law enforcement, and it didn't matter what they were doing. It didn't matter. One of them, Dion Avila, was just sitting in his car outside of Civic Center Park, and because an officer thought he moved his hands too fast on the steering wheel, shot him multiple times dead in broad daylight with people around. And it was ruled justified. So that's really what I want to change, if we are ever able to change that, but it's a constitutional standard. But it doesn't mean that we can't fight for a change in policy. So that's what I'm really looking for her to do, is how is she going to change her policy and what she reviews as prosecutable?
And then you're next.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, I think it's important to realize what is considered violent and what is considered a protest. So like, whenever there's like protests that come up about violence with minorities involved, it's always a violent protest. But for example, the electric riot in Charlottesville, where there was a woman killed, it was just a protest, and they were just protesting back to what had originally been protest. So I think it's just important to realize that a lot of the times certain groups get a more violent stance on protesting, even if it's meant to be peaceful or whatever, versus a lot of other groups don't. And I think it's also important to highlight. I also don't condone violence or whatever, but as well as it sometimes may be necessary or just in the moment felt like it's necessary. I don't say, let's go have a violent protest, but if that's what some people feel like is going to make them feel better, then I guess so be it. But I think what we really have to think about when we think about, is violence necessary? What is the mission? Is the mission to be on media? Is the mission to be, on CBS or 9 News or whatever? Is the mission to be on there, or is the mission to make a change and, reform public policy? And what is our mission? Is our mission to look like these minorities that are violent, or is our mission to actually make change and unite people, whether they look like us or not, and just kind of make that change kind of more involved?
I mean, to latch on to some of the concepts you're saying here with I know, speaking loud, but I know, it's so surprising. But to latch onto the concept of we don't want to be those violent minorities, I think we also need to remember when we speak out against a system that's set up against us, we're already violent, or at least that's been my encounter. And so it's difficult, and it definitely is a change in policy, but it's also a change in culture. It's a change in how we view each other and how society will view us. And so when we're talking about not condoning violence and what violence is, we have to remember for some people we are violent inherently. Black people are dangerous. Latinx people are dangerous. And there's nothing we can do to change that unless we are in these educated conversations where we're sitting down, speaking with people and having these dialogues. However, if you're at a neo-Nazi rally, that's not going to happen. You're not going to sit down with the neo-Nazi and say, like, so if we're looking historically at why you think this, this, and this, you're going to get punched in the face, and probably worse. So, again, with the issue of condoning violence, with the issue of thinking, well, when are we or are we not being violent? You're right. The system's rigged. You're never not going to be called peaceful for questioning a system that's set up against you, especially if they're going to violently uphold that system, uphold that power, and make sure that they maintain it. So on that issue of how do we not appear to be like the upset minority, I don't think we can, if I'm honest. I think that we should be fine with that. By continually playing into respectability politics, we're forfeiting ourselves. We're forfeiting our identities. And I'm not saying that we need to go and riot and loot and like constantly be on this high horse where we're like, I reject everything that you're saying. But I think by playing into what like the oppressor wants, by continually being like, oh, like I'll present a certain way to make white people comfortable, we're doing ourselves a disservice. We're doing our movements disservices. So that's all I have to say.
Yellow shirt and then yours.
You know when they decided to investigate Eric Holder, the police department? Just